Good morning, everybody. Great to see you this morning. Thanks for being here for this Bible class hour. We're studying in the book of Acts during this Sunday morning class, but we're doing it a little different. We're not just going verse by verse through Acts. We are actually studying different individuals or Bible characters who are identified to us in the book of Acts. Last time, of course, it was 2 weeks ago since we had our meeting last week. So 2 weeks ago, we talked about Peter. Peter's the principal player in about the first half of the book of Acts through chapter 12, thereabouts. And starting in chapter 13, then, the principal player the rest of the way through the book of Acts is the Apostle Paul. So we talked about Peter last time, and we're going to talk about the Apostle Paul this time. You know, one of the things that we point out about the Apostle Paul and the conversion of Saul of Tarsus to become the Apostle Paul, that is a great testimony, a bit of strong evidence, if you will, for our faith. Why should we believe? Why should we have confidence that Jesus Christ really is the resurrected Son of God? Why should we have that kind of confidence? Well, there's lots of different lines of reasoning that provide proof and evidence for us. But one of the really strong ones is the conversion of Saul of Tarsus. Here's a guy, and we'll talk about it in a minute, who was an adamant persecutor of the church. But when he saw the Lord Jesus on the road to Damascus, his life changed dramatically. And he went from a persecutor to, I guess, I don't know how we would argue otherwise, probably the most effective preacher of the gospel that's ever lived. And that change, if you could change Saul of Tarsus, then that's proof positive that this is all real. This is not make-believe. This is not pretended mythology. This is real. And his conversion is that kind of proof for us. Okay, so let's talk about when we first are introduced to Saul of Tarsus in Acts chapter 7. Now, in Acts 7, we have a long sermon delivered by Stephen, and at the end of Acts chapter 7, Stephen is stoned to death. We refer to him as the first Christian martyr. And it says in verse 58, Acts 7, verse 58, they cast him, Stephen, out of the city and stoned him, and the witnesses laid down their clothes at a young man's feet whose name was Saul. That's the very first reference to Saul of Tarsus. Then skip down into chapter 8. And Saul, so now we get some more information right on the heels of that. Saul was consenting unto his death, Stephen's death. And at that time there was a great persecution against the church which was at Jerusalem, and they are all scattered abroad throughout all the regions of Judea and Samaria except the apostles. And devout men carried Stephen to his burial and made great lamentation over him. As for Saul, he made havoc of the church, entering into every house and hailing men and women, committed them to prison. And so we're familiar with that part of Saul's life, but I would argue, and I think there's reason to think this is true, that he was probably the principal persecutor of the church. He was the head dog. He was at the front of that, and I think these introductory statements about him suggest that is true. He wasn't just a subordinate player in the persecution of the church. He was a ringleader, or maybe the ringleader, in the persecution of Christians. So that's just how strong he was against Christ, against Christianity. And then, of course, what changed him is in chapter 9. Skip over to chapter 9. Verse 1. Saul, yet breathing out threatenings and slaughter against the disciples of the Lord, went to thy... I don't know. We read over that. Did you ever think about the word breathing out threatenings and slaughter against the disciples of the Lord? I mean, it wasn't just that they were being persecuted, maybe, being hounded, their lives being made hard, or, they were being slaughtered. That's a strong word. They were being slaughtered. And so, verse 2, he desired of the chief priest letters to Damascus to the synagogues, that if he found any of this way, whether they were men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. As he journeyed, he came near Damascus, and suddenly there shined round about him a light from heaven. And he fell to the earth and heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? And he said, Who art thou, Lord? And the Lord said, I am Jesus, whom thou persecutest. It is hard for thee to kick against the pricks. And he, trembling and astonished, said, Lord, what wilt thou have me to do? And the Lord said unto him, Rise, go into the city, and it shall be told thee what thou must do. So, again, all of that is familiar information to us. But this was what led to his conversion. Obviously, we adamantly teach that he was not saved on the road to Damascus, but this is what started his conversion, right? His personal experience in seeing the Lord Jesus and speaking to him. Now, remember that Jesus has already been resurrected and ascended to heaven, now appears again to Saul of Tarsus here. What do you think that expression means in verse number 5? The Lord said, I am Jesus whom thou persecutest. It is hard for thee to kick against the pricks. Somebody explain that. Any ideas on that? Wayne?
Goad.
Another word is goad instead of prick.
A goad is something that you would use. We use hot shots today.
Yeah, we got a battery operated thing to give him a shot of electricity. So I got this animal and I want him to go that way, but he wants to go that way.
And the goad is designed to get him to go the way you want him to go.
Yeah.
And Saul was fighting against that vehemently.
Yeah. So what do you think? Wayne is exactly right. The King James says kick against the pricks. I think some newer versions say kick against the goads or goad. What do you think the goad or the prick was that he was fighting against? Anybody? The gospel. Certainly the gospel in general is true. I'm wondering if it wasn't not only what he was hearing of the gospel message, but also the evidence that he was seeing in these people that he was persecuting. You know, he was hard on their heels. He was doing all he could to slaughter them if he could. And yet they kept on being faithful. And I wonder if that was part of what was provoking him or urging him to change. He was resisting. He was kicking against the pricks. He was kicking against the goad. He didn't want to go that way. But there was something that kept nagging at him. Something was poking at him. And it was the gospel truth about Jesus in general. And there might have been very many different components of that. But I wonder if one strong component of that was these people. Why do these people keep doing this? I'm doing all I can to stop them, and they won't stop. Why are they so committed? I wonder if that wasn't a lot of it as well. Now, a takeaway for us from that is, in an evil world today, if we're going to be a positive influence and change people's lives, we've got to be consistent no matter what temptations or trials come our way. Continued consistency and persistence in the faith is going to influence people. I think it had a strong influence on Saul of Tarsus, and I think it will for us too. And
people still kick against the pricks today.
Yeah.
And you can tell them, something about the Bible, and they'll say, "Oh, I believe that, but we're not going to practice that."
Yeah. Yeah. The people know better but won't do better. But something is poking at them, and certainly something was poking at Saul of Tarsus here. All right. So after the Lord appeared to Saul on the road to Damascus and said, "Go in the city, it'll be told you what you must do," then the Lord appeared to a man named Ananias. Verse 10, there was a certain disciple at Damascus named Ananias. Now, notice, if he was a disciple in Damascus, he was one of the guys that Saul of Tarsus was coming there to hunt down, right? He was on a mission to find disciples in Damascus. Ananias was a disciple in Damascus. He was one of the ones that was on Saul's list. Find this guy. I don't know if he knew him by name. I don't know if the report had reached back to Jerusalem. There's a guy in Damascus. He's one of the Christians there. Get him. I don't know if he knew that specifically, but we know in general he was going to Damascus to find Christians. Ananias was one of those Christians. And he says, the Lord appears to him, verse 10, Ananias, and he said, Behold, I am here, Lord. And the Lord said to him, Arise and go into the street which is called Straight, and inquire in the house of Judas for one called Saul of Tarsus, for behold, he prayeth, and has seen in a vision a man named Ananias coming in and putting his hand on him that he might receive his sight. Then Ananias answered, Lord, I have heard by many of this man how much evil he had done to thy saints at Jerusalem, and here he hath authority from the chief priest to bind all that call on thy name. But the Lord said to him, Go thy way, for he's a chosen vessel for me to bear my name before the Gentiles and kings and children of Israel. So, I don't know, this Ananias is definitely a minor player in the book of Acts. But I'm going to tell you, you've got to admire this guy tremendously, because he knew. He's coming here to arrest me. He's coming here to arrest my brethren. He's coming here to persecute us. You want me to go see him? You know, I think that was a really natural reaction on his part. But the Lord said, yes, go. And he went. I want to tell you, that would take a strong measure of faith to go. Because this Saul of Tarsus had a notable reputation for what he had been doing to Christians. And the word had gotten out among Christians in Damascus. He's coming here for the same purpose as to what he'd been doing in Jerusalem. And they were no doubt terrified at the thought, Saul of Tarsus is coming to our city. He's coming here. He's coming after us. And Ananias expressed that hesitancy. But when the Lord said, yes, go, he went. And I'm telling you, I admire his faith, don't you? Ananias there. And that's about all we know about him. But he certainly is commendable. So the change, as soon as Ananias comes to him, he's baptized. Verse 20, Acts 9, verse 20. Straightway he preached Christ in the synagogues that he is the Son of God. There's your change. So if you can flip Saul of Tarsus, then the proof is powerful. The proof is strong. Jesus really is the resurrected Son of God. And we maybe we don't dwell on that as much as we should, but that is, why do we believe? We don't believe because we saw it. We don't believe it because we were there. Our faith is dependent upon conclusive evidence. Right there is conclusive evidence. Any thoughts and comments, anybody? Wayne?
I think it's a really telling two words that are used here. He kept increasing in strength. So this is something that took a period of time. He kept increasing the strength and confounding the Jews. Confounding the Jews is really something that wait a minute, he was one of us. He was going to kill these people, and now he's proclaiming what he was trying to destroy. I could see the confusion that would exist in the Jews' minds about Saul.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think that word was put in here by accident. They were just dumbfounded.
Yeah.
By what had taken place.
Exactly right. Sue Ann, do you have a thought?
Back up in verse 4 and 5. Paul heard the voice, and he called him Lord, and then he said, Who are you?
Yes. So the first expression, Lord, is just a statement of respect or acknowledgement. In other words, we don't use the word Lord. We would use the word Sir or Mr. And so it's just that the word Lord there is just used in that sense. They would call someone, especially someone that they perceived who was in a superior position to them. They were lords and ladies. And so he's just using that expression in the sense of acknowledging probably someone in a superior position, but he doesn't know who he is, because he even asks, "Who art thou, Lord?" And then in verse 5, Jesus identifies himself. "I am Jesus whom thou persecutest." Verse 6, he trembling and astonished said, "Lord, what wilt thou have me?" I think the Lord there, he's acknowledging Jesus as Lord and Christ, using the expression now to refer to him in his superior spiritual position. I think that's really an interesting thing that you brought up, how he calls him Lord just out of respect, but doesn't know who he's talking to. Then he calls him Lord because he's been identified as Jesus.
Well, both of the words Lord are capitalized, and that's what threw me.
Yeah, that's just an interpreter's judgment in that. It's the same word, obviously, but that's just an interpreter's rule. I don't favor that. Several of my Bibles, this one doesn't, but several of my Bibles have that capitalized Lord, and I like them to leave that up to us to make that determination. There is something interesting. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but in verse 7, let's see. Notice it says, verse 7, "The men which journeyed with him stood speechless, hearing a voice, but seeing no man." Well, skip over to chapter 22 when Paul retells this story. In chapter 22 at verse 9, now get this, this is years later, and Paul's retelling the story. In 22 verse 9, "They that were with me saw indeed the light and were afraid, but they heard not the voice of him that spake to me." Well, wait a minute. This says, in the initial account, 9:7 says, "They heard a voice, but seeing no man." And this says, "They heard not the voice of him that spake to me." Have we got just a flat out straight contradiction between chapter 9 verse 7, chapter 22 verse 9? Anybody got a thought on that? I mean, at face value, it sounds like it could be a flat out straight contradiction. Wayne?
The newer translations help us a bit. In verse 9 it says, "They did not understand the voice." We often use that expression. When somebody says something, we hear the sound, but we don't understand it. And we say, "I didn't hear you." Yeah.
So Rita hollers at you from the other end of the house, and you say, "What? I didn't hear you." Well, you heard something, obviously, right? Or you wouldn't have asked for a repeat or a clarification. And that's the explanation here. They didn't understand.
That's the skeptic's favorite passage.
Yeah.
Especially our next door neighbor.
Yeah, exactly.
To destroy the integrity of the Bible.
Yes, exactly right. It's not a contradiction. It's just using the expression in two different ways. Good point. Okay. All right. So he's converted in Damascus. Actually, in the book of Galatians, Paul gives a little more. He didn't go back. You wouldn't get this from the Acts account, but it was some considerable time later before he actually went back to Jerusalem. It wasn't like he was converted in Damascus and he went back to Jerusalem the next week. It was longer than that. I think in Galatians 2, he even mentions a period of 3 years. Let's see, I'm going to confirm that. Yeah. It says in verse 18 of Galatians 1, Galatians 1 verse 18, "After 3 years I went to Jerusalem to see Peter." You wouldn't pick up that idea that there was that much time lag in the account in the book of Acts, but it's not contradictory, but we just have additional information in Galatians 1. So after some period, after about 3 years, he goes back to Jerusalem. As you can imagine, the Christians in Jerusalem are 100% skeptical. What is going on here? As Wayne already mentioned, they're confounded. They're confused. They don't understand. How could this guy who was so strong in persecuting Christians, how could he now be preaching Christ? What would be your suspicion, especially if you're inclined to believe conspiracies? This guy's Yeah, Whit.
I think he was a spy or like trying to infiltrate.
That's right. This is a trick. This is not legitimate. He's trying to get in our circle, so then he knows which one of us to kill. Yeah, I think very much you'd be suspicious. This guy is not legitimate. Look in chapter 9. So it got so that they were going to try to kill Paul in Damascus. Verse 23 of chapter 9, after many days were fulfilled, the Jews took counsel to kill him, but their laying wait was known of Saul, and they watched the gates day and night to kill him. Then the disciples took him by night, let him down by the wall in a basket. And when Saul was come to Jerusalem, he essayed to join himself to the disciples, but they were all afraid of him and believed not that he was a disciple. But Barnabas took him and brought him to the apostles and declared unto them how he had seen the Lord in the way, and that he had spoken to him, and how he had preached boldly at Damascus in the name of Jesus. And then he was with them, coming in and going out at Jerusalem. So Barnabas was the one who spoke up for him, and when he finally did return to Jerusalem. He didn't stay there long, and he went back to his home country. He was Saul of Tarsus in Cilicia, so he went back to his hometown. We don't have time to cover all of this, but this same Barnabas was the one who was in Antioch of Syria, working among Gentile converts in a church in Antioch of Syria up to the north of Jerusalem. He left there, went and found Paul and brought him back to Antioch, and they worked together with the Christians in Antioch of Syria. There's another Antioch, but this is Antioch of Syria. And that Antioch of Syria, we don't talk about that church a whole lot, but that was a powerful church. And they served as the base of operations for Paul in all three of his missionary journeys. Paul and Barnabas were initially, in chapter 13, Paul and Barnabas were sent out from the church at Antioch. And at the end of the first and second missionary journeys, he would return to Antioch to report on the work that had been. He didn't get back there after the third missionary journey, because when he was arrested in Jerusalem. But this church in Antioch of Syria was a powerful church. On the first missionary journey, they took with them John Mark. Now we find out later find out elsewhere that John Mark was a relative of Barnabas. I think, am I right? Nephew. John Mark was Barnabas's nephew. Sister son to Barnabas. I think that's right. Now, they were. This is Acts 13:13. This is the first missionary journey. When Paul and his company loosed from Paphos, they came to Perga in Pamphylia, and John, departing from them, returned to Jerusalem. And then they continued on this second mission. By all accounts, I don't think there's any discrepancy about this at all. By all accounts, they were entering into a really dangerous territory. That particular area that they would be traveling in was notorious for highwaymen and robbers, people who would soon kill you, as look at you and rob you of everything you had, including your life. And Paul and Barnabas and the group with them, they were traveling into that region to preach the gospel of Christ. It certainly appears to be the case that John Mark, we know him as Mark, that he was afraid, that he was literally afraid for his life, and he left and went back to Jerusalem. That's all it's said about it right there. But we know that later, when they got ready to go on a second missionary journey, this became the bone of contention between Paul and Barnabas. In chapter 15, Acts 15, some days after, Paul said to Barnabas, "Let us go again and visit our brethren in every city where we have preached the word of the Lord, and see how they do." And Barnabas determined to take with them John, whose surname was Mark. But Paul thought not good to take him with them, who departed from them from Pamphylia, and went not with them to the work. And the contention was so sharp between them that they departed asunder one from the other. Barnabas took Mark and sailed to Cyprus. Paul chose Silas and departed, and so on it goes. Colossians, I had this note in my margin here. This is what I was looking for. Colossians 4, verse 10. Colossians 4:10. Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, saluteth, and Marcus, sister's son to Barnabas. So that is the family connection. Paul and Barnabas had worked hand in hand on that amazing first missionary journey. Paul says, let's go back. We'll see everybody that we saw before. Barnabas apparently was in full agreement that would be a thing to do. But Barnabas wants to take Mark. Paul said, I'm not taking that guy. He bailed on us the first time. I don't have any confidence in him. I don't want him to go. They couldn't resolve that. Now, this is not, get this, this is not a doctrinal issue. This is not a question of doctrine. It's a judgment call, right? It's a judgment call. Should we take John Mark or not? And Barnabas was convinced yes, and Paul was convinced no, and they couldn't resolve that difference of agreement. And so they parted working company. They went separate ways. Neither one of them have abandoned the Lord. Nobody's sinned. Nobody's been unfaithful in this matter at all. It's just that sometimes situations arise where you just can't resolve judgment issues like that, and it's better to part company. This was not bad. This was not a bad thing. It probably actually constituted an ability to spread out their work and do even more than they would have done otherwise. But this is often pointed out, sometimes it's just better to go different ways. All can be faithful and true to the Lord, but just go different ways.
It was an opinion of two men. If they'd been a third one there, maybe throw his opinion in, it might have changed.
Well, you got two, and they're just completely out. These two opinions are as opposite as they can be. And they can't resolve it. Yeah. I know Wayne would agree with me. I know when I've traveled overseas, you want to have great confidence in the people you're traveling with, don't you, Wayne? It's essential. If and there's been a time or two when I was with some people some people were at least in the same general area, and I didn't have confidence in them. And that's just not a good thing. You're living in one another's skin, so to speak, when you're in those kind of circumstances. And you want to have great confidence in the people you're working with. Wayne?
Barnes writes about the sharpness of words that's used here. He says that the sharpness of the disagreement was so sharp that the word that's used means a violent altercation. Now, this is not physical. I don't think he would say this was physical violence. But in the first or second trip we made to Africa, I had a violent confrontation with one of our members.
Yeah.
What the practice of buying a wife with gifts and money, which I gave you a laundry list of what Felix had to go through. He believed that because the family of the bride required such a huge dowry, that he believed that this was causing the bride and groom, potential bride and groom, to become unfaithful to the Lord because of their lack of self-control. And so he believed that was fostering sin. And he was really pressing them to change that, but it was an ingrained custom within the culture. And I kept saying, that is not something that we need to worry about. What we do is preach the truth. Let them deal with their own culture and changing And that disagreement became very, very sharp.
Yeah.
And so we look at this and we kind of gloss over and think, well, they had a minor disagreement.
Yeah.
It was a huge deal. It was a violent confrontation.
Yeah, I think that's a great explanation. Again, nobody. This is not sin and righteousness. This is a question of. But if I'm going, I got to have confidence in who I'm going with. That's Paul's position. I have no confidence in John Mark. I just can't go. And I mean, they're going right back into the same territories. They're going back where literally their lives were endangered probably on a daily basis. Not just from persecutors, but just from robbers and violent men. And Paul says, I just don't have any confidence in him. I can't go with him. And Barnabas, of course, you got to understand, Barnabas had a bias in this. He was a relative. He was his nephew. Barnabas probably wants to shore this kid up, strengthen him. And so you can see both sides of the story. They couldn't resolve it. And so they went separate ways. Now, real quickly, skip to over in second. Where am I wanting to go? 2 Timothy 4. Not sure this is what I want or not. Paul actually speaks favorably. No, that's not what I want. 2 Timothy 4:11. 2 Timothy 4:11. These are Paul's final words by inspiration. And he says, only Luke is with me. Take Mark and bring him with thee, for he is profitable to me for the ministry. So I've always thought this is really commendable in the case of Paul. He changed it. So Mark had proved himself. Barnabas saw that potential, and Barnabas nurtured that potential. And Mark proved himself to be faithful and loyal and effective in the kingdom work. And Paul is man enough to acknowledge that and say, bring Mark. He's profitable to me and to the cause. So, a lot of times, so here's the other side of the story. A lot of times when we have these differences of agreement, I'm so locked into what I think that I'm not ever going to change. You won't ever be able to change my mind. I've had people actually tell me this. We are never going to agree about this. I've had people actually say those words. Well, if you're proved wrong, you need to admit it. And Paul wasn't necessarily proved wrong, but he was able to change his opinion of Mark because Mark had proved himself to be a faithful servant. And that's commendable. Any thoughts on John Mark? It's probably more than we need, but any more thoughts on John Mark? All right. Go to Acts 20. There's so much in Acts to pick out. I mean, we're just picking out highlights from Paul's work as described in the book of Acts. In Acts 20, you remember, he's on his way back to Jerusalem. This is the end of the third missionary journey. And Paul's on his way back to Jerusalem. But he wants to have a meeting with the elders of the church at Ephesus. Apparently he doesn't really want to go to Ephesus for fear he'll be detained there because he's got a time deadline. He wants to get back to Jerusalem in time for a certain feast day. So he calls the elders of Ephesus to come and meet him closer to the route that he would be traveling. He doesn't actually go to Ephesus. He calls them. They meet him. And in Acts 20 verse 26, he says, wherefore I take you to record this day that I am pure from the blood of all men, for I have not shunned to declare unto you all the counsel of God. So, all the counsel of God, he said. And he said, Paul says, I won't be held accountable in regards to you all, because I have declared all the counsel of God. I didn't leave anything off. And it won't be the case that you're going to go to judgment ignorant of some bit of information that I should have told you and I didn't. I have not shunned to declare unto you all the counsel of God. There's a real point there about our preaching today. It needs to cover it all. And we've talked about this a lot, and we've used this passage a lot. Unfortunately, there are some people who don't want to cover all aspects of the gospel. There are some preachers, in fact, who actually pronounce they are determined to only be dealing with positive things. They don't want to deal with negative things. Well, if you're going to preach all the counsel of God, you're going to deal with both positive and negative things. It's just necessary. You can't leave any of that off. But I'm concerned that a lot of modern preachers, even among our own brethren, I'm not just talking about denominational folks for sure, but even among our own brethren, I'm afraid there are some who would not be able to confidently make the statement that the Apostle Paul made there, I am free from the blood of all men. I've not shunned to declare all the counsel of God. All right, real quickly, we're going to run out of time. Let's move a little bit deeper into Acts chapter 23. Chapter 23, verse 1. In Acts 23, verse 1, Paul earnestly beholding the council. Now remember, he's been arrested in Jerusalem. This is at the end of the third missionary journey. He's been arrested at Jerusalem. Paul earnestly beholding the council said, Men and brethren, I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day. How much of Paul's life do you think he has in consideration there when he says, I've lived in all good conscience before God until this day? How far back does that go? He said, I've got a clear conscience. How far back did his clear conscience run? Anybody? Any thoughts?
Well, he thought when he was persecuting the Christians, he was surely doing it,
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're right. I think that statement includes when he was persecuting Christians. He had always, as a principle of his life, was to maintain a clear conscience. And even when he was a practicing Jew and adamantly persecuting Christians, he was doing that with a good conscience. Now, we've tried to make the point before that is, really indicates the possibility that, people can have a clear conscience and be dead wrong. Your conscience is a good thing. Our conscience is a God-given tool, and we ought to employ it. In other words, we want to maintain a clear conscience. We should never violate our conscience. But a conscience can be wrong if it's not trained properly. Let's skip over to chapter 26. In Acts chapter 26, verse 9, again, Paul, in another one of those instances where he's sort of retelling his life story. In 26:9, he said, I verily thought with myself that I ought to do many things contrary to the name of Jesus of Nazareth, which thing I also did in Jerusalem, and many of the saints did I shut up in prison, having received authority from the chief priest, and when they were put to death, I gave my voice against them. I thought, and this is what Eric is referring to, he said, I thought that this was what I was supposed to be doing. I thought this is what God wanted me to do. That's a really great reference for us, because we encounter people a lot who are trusting their conscience. Well, conscience is a good thing if properly trained, but conscience is not the acid test. It's not the be-all and end-all, because your conscience can be misguided. And so, we have to understand conscience in the right way. Thoughts or comments there, anybody? All right. So we know, and we often reference the kind of things that Paul himself ended up suffering because he was a Christian, because he was proclaiming the gospel. In 2 Corinthians 11, we know some of the horrible things that he endured. 2 Corinthians 11, verse 24. Of the Jews 5 times received I 40 stripes, save one. Thrice was I beaten with rods. Once was I stoned. Thrice I suffered shipwreck. A night and a day I have been in the deep. In journeyings often, in perils of water, in perils of robbers, in perils by my own countrymen, in perils by the heathen, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren, in weariness and painfulness, in watchings often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold and nakedness. Besides those things which are without, that which cometh upon me daily, the care of all the churches. So Paul really did, completely reversal of roles from the guy who was the ringleader of persecution against Christians now to the guy who is most sought after, most persecuted among Christians, no doubt. He had seen that complete role reversal. But he never gave up, and our author asks us to contemplate just his final remarks there in 2 Timothy 4. And I'm going to use this in the sermon today too. 2 Timothy 4 verse 6. I'm now ready to be offered the time of my departure is at hand. I have fought a good fight. I have finished my course. I have kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord the righteous judge shall give me at that day, and not to me only, but unto all them also that love his appearing. So the thing that kept Paul motivated was, well, first of all, he absolutely knew it was true. Jesus is the resurrected Son of God. Paul had no doubt about that based upon his own eyewitness experience. And that faith carried him through all the trials that he had faced, and he was willing to pay the price that he had paid for that all. What's your judgment? I said earlier, I think he probably almost without question became the most effective preacher of the gospel that has ever existed. Of course, we don't know them all. How can you say that when you don't even know all the preachers of the gospel that there have been through the centuries? But I'm convinced that he holds that status. But he says in 1 Corinthians 2, it wasn't because he was eloquent in speech. It wasn't because he was a great preacher, because I'm telling you, when he got up before a crowd, he could just hold the crowd in the palm of his hand. He spoke with such great oratorical skill that nobody could. That wasn't it, right? That wasn't what made him a great preacher. It was his devotion, his commitment. He was a great man for sure. Wrote the principal part of our New Testament books. I quizzed the kids on this on Sunday evening. How many books in the New Testament? 27. How many did Paul write? How many of the New Testament books did Paul write? 13, maybe 14, if we include Hebrews as being written by him, which there's a strong indication it probably was, I guess. We can't say conclusively the Hebrew writer doesn't identify himself. But he wrote a principal part of our New Testament, wrote more of our New Testament than any other individual inspired writer. And so he was able to face death there in those last words that we just read with confidence that there was a crown of life laid up for him. And it'd be great if we could speak with that same kind of conviction and confidence as we approach death. Comments about the Apostle Paul? Paul?
I've always liked Paul because, for me, his story that's told in the Bible, not story, I want to tell how it's told to us. I think about that there's been more people on this world that weren't Christians than are. And his story is someone who wasn't a Christian who became.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important to show everyone who's not a Christian, who's done horrible things, you can be a Christian.
You can be forgiven and you can change.
And you will be challenged.
Yeah,
But at the end, you will be rewarded.
exactly
So I
right.
think his story is the second most important story.
Good point. Good point. Rita?
I was on Paul too, from the perspective of, God could see his heart, and that he genuinely believed when he believed something, he was bold. And
He was 100%. If he,
he's all in.
Yeah.
And so, I think God chose him because he would be all in
for the truth.
For the truth.
Yeah.
He'd be bold, and he was.
I think it.
There's probably people today that you might think, oh, they're so off, and they're always trying to understand. But
Don't you? I think you're exactly right. So you think about this individual that you know, and he's not a Christian. You think, there's no use trying to reach him. You couldn't convert him no matter what. Well, look, wouldn't you have said that about Saul of Tarsus? I think we would have said, you couldn't convert that guy no matter what. Yet look what he became. Good point. All right, thanks everybody.